So again, welcome to tonight's seminar on Spring Festival, a guide to the customs and history. Spring Festival is literally coming up upon us, so I thought this would be a very timely period to do this particular seminar. Spring Festival officially, Chinese New Year, the New Year's Day, is on February 1st. However, there is a whole bunch of stuff that happens before that. So during the first half of this seminar, I'll be talking about the mythical origins behind Spring Festival and taking a closer look at the festivities that take place before New Year's Eve. And then in the second half of the seminar, I'm going to be going through what actually happens from New Year's Eve onwards. So once we get to the point before New Year's Day, and then there are festivities that happen long after New Year's Day that are just as important, sometimes even, I suppose, almost as important as New Year's Day. So as with many of these ancient traditions in China, the historical origins of Spring Festival are shrouded in mystery. It is believed that some type of Spring Festival or New Year celebration was initiated by the imperial court of the Shang dynasty, although we have no idea what customs and traditions were associated with this festival, other than the fact that ancestor worship played this really kind of key role. By about the Western Zhou dynasty, so still prior, oh sorry, we've got someone who has, I'm going to, bear with me 1 second. No, there we go. So you now officially cannot unmute yourselves. I have banned you until the end of the seminar. So by the Western Zhou dynasty, which is still pre-imperial China, so pre the unification of China, we do know that a connection had been made between a New Year celebration and agriculture in the country, as it became the time when agricultural practices would begin. It was actually during the Han Dynasty, so sort of long after Imperial China had been established, that distinct rituals began to form around a New Year celebration, such as ceremonial gatherings and the use of a type of kind of primordial firework, which was actually just a burning tube of bamboo. We refer to this as a kind of proto-firework because when bamboo is set on fire, the heat causes the inner cavity of the bamboo to expand until it eventually explodes and makes a really loud banging sound. So very similar to a firework, a bit more like a firecracker, but the end result was that you're trying to make a really loud noise, essentially. Firecrackers themselves started to make an appearance towards the end of the Three Kingdoms period, so around about the sort of 3rd century, and were a main part of the tradition by around about the Jin dynasty, so around about the 5th century. It was also during this time period that the concept of shou shui, or guarding the year, was introduced, but I'll talk about what that is a bit more in a moment. It was really during the Tang dynasty, so the second golden age in Chinese history, from about the 7th century, till the 10th, that the tradition of displaying lanterns with riddles inside of them during the Lantern Festival became popularized. And again, I'll talk about that a bit more after the break. While it's really during the Song dynasty, so around about 960 to 1279, that brought with it the custom of lighting hollowed out bamboo poles that had been loaded with gunpowder as a slightly more advanced type of firework. So you really see, particularly during the Song dynasty, when gunpowder becomes more refined, two really interesting developments: fireworks start to become more refined, and also proto guns start to appear in China. But that's really more, I did a seminar on the 4 great inventions of ancient China. That was really more involved in that. So we won't talk about that today. So throughout Chinese history, each dynasty formed its own customs and traditions surrounding the Spring Festival celebration. But the current and standardized version of Spring Festival that is celebrated today wasn't solidified until 1911. Now, with all that history out of the way, let's take a look at the legendary origin story behind the Spring Festival, which honestly kind of reads more like the beginning of a horror story than the beginning of a New Year celebration. What most people don't know about Chinese New Year is that its origins are rather monstrous, to put it lightly. The story of Spring Festival begins with a horrifying creature known as the Nian, which is sometimes referred to in English as the Nian beast, because the word Nian also means year. What is particularly interesting about this mythical creature is that there is no record of him in any ancient Chinese text, including well-known bestiaries like the 4th century BC's classic of Mountain and Sea, one of the most famous kind of books about ancient Chinese creatures. The legend of the Nian is an entirely sort of oral tradition, but its legacy pervades every aspect of the Spring Festival tradition. So we know it was highly important around about the time that these sort of celebrations and customs began to be established. Whether or not it's a true story, I'll leave that up to you. All we know is that the story of Nian is believed to go back thousands of years, to a period in Chinese history that is referred to rather nebulously as Shanggu, or the ancient times. This beast was supposedly so powerful that other beasts and even demons dared not get on its bad side. And it once killed every wild beast in the mountains and drove several species to extinction just to win a bet. As you can imagine, mankind was really no match for such a formidable creature. For some unknown reason, however, Nian would only ever emerge from the forest or crawl out of the sea once every year on the run up to the new year, when it would devour any person that it came across. Villagers would therefore flee into the mountains before New Year in the hopes of escaping the beast. This was, however, until one year, when the locals of Peach Blossom Village were making preparations to leave for the New Year period. An old beggar entered the village, but no one paid him any attention, as they were too busy getting their supplies ready for their trip into the mountains. There was only one elderly woman who noticed him and gave him some dumplings to help tide him over during this sort of trying time. When he had finished eating, the old woman beseeched him to follow her into the mountains, as the Nian was fast approaching and would surely kill him if he stayed behind. The beggar promised that he would drive the monster away from them, but he needed one thing in return. He wanted permission to stay in her house overnight while she was away. In spite of the woman's entreaties, the beggar would not be moved, so she granted him permission to stay in her home, and then she headed up into the mountains alone. Night fell, and the dreaded Nian beast dashed into the village, but was furious to find that it had been abandoned, so there was no one there to eat. That was when it noticed that there were still a few candles in the old lady's house, so it rushed towards it in the hopes of finding someone to devour. When it had arrived, it was horrified to find a piece of red paper stuck to the door. Loud sounds like thunder began emanating from the house, and the beast was paralyzed by fear. At that moment, the beggar burst out of the house wearing a red robe, and the Nian bolted off into the darkness with its tail between its legs. The next day, the villagers returned and were delighted to find that their homes, livestock, and grain stores had not been eaten and were in fact intact. While the beggar himself was long gone, the villagers found remnants of what had happened inside of the elderly woman's house. Strewn across the ground were a few candles, some used firecrackers, and reams of red paper. They realized then that the beggar had actually been a celestial being who had been, this kind of happens a lot, celestial beings in disguise. So this particular celestial being had been sent down to tell them how to ward off the Nian beast. Overjoyed at the fact that they would never need fear the Nian again, they held a huge banquet and then traveled to nearby villages to tell them how to defeat the Nian beast. From that day onwards, during the New Year period, people would stick red paper couplets to their doors, keep their homes well lit, and set off firecrackers in order to scare the Nian away or to deter it from ever visiting them again. The next day would then be spent visiting friends and relatives in order to congratulate them on having survived the night and for making it into the next year successfully. Nowadays, however, the Nian has kind of been reduced to a modicum of its former glory, featuring, for example, as a harmless character in children's films, and even, and this will be our one video for the day, but I thought it was quite amusing, in a McDonald's commercial. So I'll bring that up now. I won't put the sound on too high because it is all in Chinese, but I think if you do understand the Chinese, it's quite simple. It's quite a funny little advert here.
给我新年新一宝。不给。你没看出来我是谁吗？我是年啊，那个一到除夕就出来大吃特吃的年啊。除夕还没到，可我已经闻到了新年的味道。不给。给片蘑菇也行啊。麦当劳新年新一宝餐，超值晚餐、午餐15元起。
So for anyone who doesn't speak Chinese or didn't understand what was happening, the Nian approaches this guy, asks him for his hamburger, and the guy says no. The Nian says, "Do you know who I am? I'm the big scary demon, year beast demon." And he's like, "Spring Festival hasn't started yet, so I'm not worried about you," which is great. So yeah, that's unfortunately what he has been reduced to. What most people don't appreciate, however, is that Spring Festival is a multi-day event, and each day has its own special significance. So for now, I'll be going through each day of Spring Festival and what happens on that day. For the purposes of expediency, I may sandwich together 2 days together in one slide. So some days have their own slide, some days there's not a lot going on, so I've sort of mushed them into two. So the first one we're going to start off with is known as 腊八节, or the Laba Festival. It's important to note the Laba Festival is not technically part of Spring Festival, but it is often cited as a pre-festival celebration because it is the last major festival before the preparations for the new year can begin. So kind of like what Thanksgiving is in America to Christmas. You can't put up your Christmas decorations until you've had Thanksgiving. It is so named because it takes place on the 8th day of the 12th month, according to the Chinese lunar calendar, with La referring to La Yue, or the 12th lunar month, and Ba meaning 8 for the 8th day. Now, it's believed that celebration of this particular festival began over 2,000 years ago, and it was originally to commemorate the new harvest, but it had no fixed date until after Buddhism entered China during the 1st century AD. According to Buddhist legend, the Buddha had been wandering for many years on his quest for enlightenment, and in that time he had become so emaciated that he looked as skinny as a bird. One day, a passing shepherdess saw him in his emaciated state and offered him a bowl of rice porridge, which had been made with beans, rice, and milk. After eating the porridge, the Buddha regained his strength and began meditating under a bodhi tree. Following this fortuitous event, on the 8th day of the 12th lunar month, he attained enlightenment. For this reason, one of the main customs during this festival is the eating of special laba porridge, which is also sometimes referred to as laba konji. During the festival itself, steaming hot bowls of this porridge are given out to the public for free at Buddhist temples as part of the festivities. It's quite nice. It's sort of a nice day out. Every region in China has its own special recipe for the dish, but the main ingredients are always rice and sticky rice. It is generally a kind of sweet food, however, and can include things like crystallized sugar, red dates, lotus seeds, walnuts, chestnuts, almonds, longgans, hazelnuts, raisins, red beans, peanuts, water caltrops, rose leaf, and other what are known as treasures that go into the porridge. Since the Laba Festival takes place during the height of winter, it makes for a kind of wonderfully warming dish that is full of protein and nutrients to combat the winter cold. Now, another and albeit rather stranger custom that comes with the festival is the making of laba garlic, which is a custom that's only really practiced around the area surrounding Beijing. On the day of the festival, it is customary to soak purple peel garlic in vinegar and then add a little bit of sugar. This garlic is then left to ferment in a jar until New Year's Eve, so it does directly connect with the Spring Festival, and then is eaten as part of the New Year's Eve banquet. So now let's get straight into what happens during Spring Festival itself, starting with what's known as Little New Year, or in Chinese, Xiao, meaning little, Nian, year, Xiao Nian. Little New Year, which is sometimes referred to as Preliminary Eve, is when preparations for the new year officially begin. It is celebrated on the 23rd day of the final month in the calendar of northern China, but it takes place on the 24th day in southern China. So there is a north-south divide. You get that with a lot of different festival celebrations. What you eat when you celebrate often has a north-south divide. On this day, people will start buying food in anticipation of their banquet on New Year's Eve. It is also sometimes referred to as the Festival of the Kitchen God, since people are expected to make sacrifices to the kitchen god on this day. Now, the kitchen god's role, if you don't know, is to watch over the household and to oversee the family's moral character, so that at the end of the year, he can report on their behavior to heaven. So he goes up to heaven on the run up to New Year, and lets everyone in heaven know whether or not your family has been well behaved. Some families will even wipe something sweet, such as honey, over the mouth of the image of the kitchen god that sits in their homes, in the hopes that he will only say sweet words about them. Once the sacrifices have been made, the image of the kitchen god, as you can see here, is burned, which is believed to dispatch him to the heavens so that he can go ahead and make his report. He is then welcomed back into the home by pasting a new paper image of him beside the stove. Now, you may be surprised to hear that no one is safe from the big spring clean. So the 24th day of the last lunar month is the customary day for cleaning the house, regardless of whether you're in the north or the south. It just coincides with the kitchen god day. So if you're in the south, you also burn the kitchen god on this day. It all happens. So you burn the kitchen god, and then you can clean up after that, which is great. Killing two birds with one stone. Families will work together to do a really kind of deep clean of the house. So we're not talking about just your average kind of spritzing up. We're talking about a full deep clean. The idea behind this is that you're meant to be throwing out the old and making space for the new in the year to come. According to Chinese tradition, ghosts and deities must choose to either return to heaven or stay on earth during the last month of the year. In order to ensure that potentially any kind of troublesome ghosts make a timely departure from your home, you must thoroughly clean the house, right down to every nook and cranny. So you kind of fish them out and convince them to go back up to heaven. On the next day, tradition dictates that the family should make and eat tofu, because it's believed that the Jade Emperor descends from heaven in order to spy on people. So you want to show them how humble you are by just eating simple tofu, to say, you know, we don't have much money, we're just eating some tofu. Please give us more money in the future and don't sort of judge us too much. Now, the next 2 days are all about eating meat, so being very extravagant, as day 26 is known as Meat Stew Day, and day 27 is known as Slaughter the Chicken Day, which I'm sure chickens are thrilled about. Hence why I've chosen this somewhat euphemistic graphic, because if you look up sort of real images of what happens on this day, it's not the most pleasant kind of viewing. Wouldn't recommend it. The 26th day was traditionally the day to slaughter pigs, cut up the meat, and make an important stewed pork dish known as Hong Shao Rou. This tradition understandably goes back to imperial times, when most families were typically too poor to eat meat on a regular basis. So quite similar to the turkey in the UK during Victorian times, probably the only time when the family would get to eat meat, and they would eat something like a duck, not a turkey. So during the year, they would save what little money they could, and then eventually purchase as much meat as they possibly could for Spring Festival. On this day, the family would be allowed to have a small taste of meat to satisfy their cravings in the form of Hong Shao Rou, but the bulk of the meat would be saved for the New Year's Eve banquet. Now, some people call this tradition Sha Zhu, or literally slaughtering pigs, which you can see just there, very nice, which refers to the farmers who own livestock, while others call it Ge Rou, or cutting meat, which applies to those people who buy the meat at the market on this day. So if you're a farmer, it's called Sha Zhu, slaughtering the pigs. If you're just a regular person buying meat, it's Ge Rou, cutting meat. The bloodshed does not end there, however. On the 27th day, it was time to prepare the chicken, and in imperial times, that meant slaughtering your own rooster, plucking it, and preparing it to be eaten as part of the New Year's Eve banquet. So really not a great day for any animal that happened to be in the vicinity of hungry people. And then finally, the 27th day of the last month represents your last opportunity to paste Spring Festival couplets onto the door of your home, which are believed to bring good fortune in the coming year and are, of course, connected to the legend of Nian, because they're red, they're meant to scare him off from your door. It is also customary to decorate the interior of your home on this day with paper cuttings, which are again meant to protect the house from demons. Then on the 29th day, which is effectively the last day of preparation and the day before New Year's Eve, family members must set aside time to worship their ancestors. Traditionally, people are meant to visit the graves of their ancestors in order to honour their memory. So with all that out the way, I'm sure you're all very excited to find out about what happens on New Year's Eve.